The United Kingdom, once a land that suffered perennial invasions and constant conflict, became a global superpower that was at the center of global events for some 300 years, only to return to regional power status. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of the United Kingdom. The earliest evidence we have of human occupation in the UK dates from some 900,000 years ago, a series of footprints and stone tools made at Happisburgh in the Norfolk coast. While the oldest human fossils are a mere 500,000 years old and were found at Boxgrove in Sussex, and come from a time when the islands were still connected to the European mainland. More recent archaeological sites such as Starcar and Howick House date from 10,000 and 9,000 years ago respectively, while its famous stone circles like those at Callanish, Avebury, Giant's Ring, and of course Stonehenge date from roughly 5,000 years ago. In more recent times, population grew and saw migration flows from the mainland. These newcomers, a group originally from Central Europe known as Celts, dominated much of the British Isles by 500 BC. They divided themselves into some 20 tribes, including the Cantiaci in today's county of Kent, the Iceni in Norfolk, the Brigantes in northwest England, the Picts and Caledoni in Scotland, the Ordivices in parts of Wales, and the Scoti in Ireland. Known particularly for their art, which is extensive in its scope, our information about them is limited because they lacked a written language, and thus, most of what we know comes from Roman sources. And the reason for that is that the Romans invaded the island and made it into a province of its empire they called Britannia. The Romans first tried to do so with Julius Caesar in 55 BC, but it was mostly unsuccessful. Rather, it would take until 43 AD when Emperor Claudius sent an invasion force under the command of Aulus Plautius. The Roman rule in the islands would begin in earnest. Probably landing on the east coast of Kent, they made their way slowly inland. Within 6 years, they had conquered much of southern England with the defeat of the Catubellani leader, Caratacus, in 50 AD, but it would take until 77 to conquer Wales and until 84 AD for the Romans to reach their furthest point under the leadership of Gnaeus Julius Agricola. Despite this last success, the Romans could never successfully occupy the northern part of the island, and thus created fortifications to protect them from the attacks of the Picti, the Hadrian and Antonine walls, built in 122 and 142 AD respectively. What is now Northern Ireland would also avoid becoming part of the Roman Empire, as no attempt to conquer that area ever came. In England itself, the most famous resistance came from the warrior queen Boudicca, who led the Iceni and other tribes in an uprising in 6061 AD. Their effort was crushed, but not before they managed to kill some 80,000 people after burning down several towns, including Verulamium, what is now St. Albans, and Londinium, or London. Roman Britannia lasted almost 4 centuries. Intermarriage was common between locals and incomers from all corners of the empire, including today's Belgium, Spain, and Syria, leading to the development of a Romano-British population, particularly in the towns, while indigenous Celtic British culture remained in rural areas. This brought stability and wealth to the region, as the Romans introduced agriculture, urban planning, industrial production, and architecture, as well as Christianity. By the 4th century, Roman power began to decline, however. Civil wars in the empire depleted the military force in the province, as some of the soldiers stationed in Britannia took part, making it easier for any barbarian group that wanted to attack. This is exactly what happened in 367 AD, when the province saw sustained attacks by the Saxons, Picts, and Scoti, leading to a year-long crisis that came to be called the Great Conspiracy. Order was restored by Count Theodosius, but continued threats to the heart of the empire convinced Rome to withdraw more troops by 407 AD. 3 years later, the Romano-British deposed the remaining Roman officials, reverting much of the government back to the city level, and marking the end of Roman control of the island. In the next century, as the economy deteriorated, a group of invaders would take advantage. On the one hand, there were the Angles and Saxons, Teutonic tribes from what is now Germany, who would gradually take control over most of what is now England, dividing it into a complex array of ever-changing polities and kingdoms. There were also the Scoti from what is now Ireland, who would do likewise in what is now Wales and western Scotland. Thus, by the late 6th century, there were a number of kingdoms that dotted the future UK, including 7 Anglo-Saxon ones in modern England: East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, Sussex, and Wessex. Several in modern Wales, such as Powys, Dyfed, and Gwynedd, 3 in modern Scotland, Strathclyde, Dalriata, and Fortriu, as well as Ullid in what is now Northern Ireland. These were constantly in conflict with each other and other even smaller polities, leading to complex arrangements of political alliances. Still, as the Anglo-Saxon footprint continued to grow in the island, new settlements were created in a new language, Old English, mostly replaced Latin and Celtic. Christianity was extinguished for a while, but after it was reintroduced by August of Canterbury in the 7th century, Britain became fertile ground for monasteries and learned Christian men. It even produced Saint Bede, a monk widely considered one of the greatest teachers and writers of the era. Meanwhile, there was a slow consolidation towards larger kingdoms, which was accelerated by yet another group of invaders. Norsemen from modern Norway and Denmark, popularly known as Vikings, began raiding the British Isles early in the 9th century. At first, the Norsemen limited their attentions to churches and monasteries, which had few defenses and much wealth, using the Orkney, Shetland, and Western Isles as their basis for the task. In 865, however, they opted to mount a full invasion of Britain. The Great Heathen Army, the name the Anglo-Saxons gave the Danish forces, first landed in East Anglia, conquered York in 866, and marched deep into Mercia in 867, forcing tribute and breaking temporary alliances as they went, most famously when they killed King Edmund of East Anglia in 869, a man who had provided them with horses when they first landed in the island. By 878, only Wessex and their king, Alfred the Great, remained unconquered. In May of that year, the Norsemen moved to finish the job but were soundly defeated at the Battle of Edington, a spot which is marked today by King Alfred's Tower in Somerset. As a result of their victory, Wessex was not only able to maintain its independence, but as they pushed the Danes back, King Alfred gained control over Mercia. These gains were made easier by the fact that the Mercians under the King Athelred had tried to expand into Wales but were crushed at the Battle of Conwy in 881, leaving them severely weakened. As a result, Alfred was able to declare himself king of the Anglo-Saxons in 886. He would go on to codify a number of laws, as well as create a wide system of fortifications known as burhs, to deter further Viking attacks from the Danelaw. This was the name given to the territory that remained under Norseman control in the northeastern part of the island, a legacy you can still see in the many town names that end in B and Thorpe. Meanwhile, in the north, Kenneth MacAlpin, the king of Dalriada, was able to gain control of the Pictish kingdom around 843 AD, a consolidation that would form the basis of the kingdom of Alba, the Gaelic name for Scotland, which would then be further expanded under Malcolm I in the 11th century with the annexation of the kingdom of Strathclyde. In 1058, Malcolm's great-grandson, Malcolm III, would found the Canmore dynasty, which would rule Scotland for about 200 years. The Danelaw would also last around 2 centuries, until Alfred's son and successor, Edward the Elder, took control of it, becoming the first king to rule the whole of England. Edward's son, Athelstan, took the process a stage further and convinced the Welsh kings to recognize him as their overlord in exchange of an anti-Viking alliance in 927. Raids from Scandinavia would then continue in the 10th century, swinging control of the island several times, going from Saxon to Dane and back to Saxon again. And then yet another invader showed up on the scene. This time it was a group from France, the Normans. They were led by William the Conqueror, who was convinced he was the rightful heir to the English throne and not Harold Godwin's, Edward the Confessor's brother-in-law. To prove this, William showed up with an army. The two met with their forces at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066, where Harold was promptly killed, according to tradition by an arrow in the eye. William was then crowned king on Christmas Day of that year at Westminster Abbey. In order to secure his hold on power, William immediately confiscated the lands of the English elite who resisted him, as well as lands close to the Welsh border to boost the security of the realm. In the following decades, the Norman conquerors made London their capital and kept mostly to themselves, creating a strict hierarchy that became the basis for the class system that still dominates Britain today. They also influenced the Scottish court, which not only adopted some of the Norman ways, but even granted land to some of their families. Conflict over the throne and territory would remain a constant for centuries to come. Between 1138 and 1153, there was a civil war known as the Anarchy that ultimately placed Henry II on the English throne. Then there were 10 distinct wars pitting the English and French between 1109 and 1243, which gradually resulted in the complete loss of the Angevin Empire, the land the English controlled in France. Of these wars, the most important, however, was probably the 1213 iteration, because that one sparked a revolt of English lords against King John in 1215, which in turn produced the Magna Carta, a royal charter that recognized the rights of the barons and which would inspire future constitutional demands. Nearly 70 years later, in 1283, John's grandson, Edward I, conquered Wales and retained the territory as a royal fief, an endowment that by custom would later go to the heir to the English throne, the Prince of Wales. Edward tried to do the same with Scotland, but despite some initial successes, he was defeated by the Scots army under the leadership of William Wallace at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. This appeared temporary since Wallace then lost at Falkirk in 1298 and was forced to flee, only to be caught and executed in August 1305. But then Edward died, and his successor was crushed at the Battle of Bannockburn by Robert the Bruce in 1314, ensuring Scottish independence for several more centuries. English and French conflict returned with the 100 Years' War that occurred between 1337 and 1453, interrupted by intermittent truces and the Black Death. The socio-economic troubles war with France brought, along with its rampant militarism, led in turn to a civil war now dubbed the Wars of the Roses, yet another fight over the throne, this time between the houses of Lancaster and York. Ironically, the war led to the rise of a completely different line of rulers, the Tudors, who would rule the country for the next 2 centuries. The first of the new monarchs, Henry VII, placed the kingdom in a more stable economic footing, but 2 other Tudors would be far more consequential. First came Henry VIII, who in pursuit of variously an heir, political alliances, and beauty, ended up with 6 different wives and had 2 of them executed. This might well have ended up as some bizarre trivia, if not for the fact that in trying to annul his original marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he broke with the Catholic Church when the Pope refused to grant it, precipitating the English Reformation and setting up his country for future religious strife. Indeed, when his successor, Edward VI, died at age 15, Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, became queen and tried to have Catholicism restored as England's official religion. This led directly to the execution of 283 people accused of heresy and the exile of many more, earning her the Protestant moniker of Bloody Mary. Mary's unexpected death in 1558, however, cut her reign short, and the throne passed to Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn. The new queen ruled for 45 years, a golden age for English history characterized by the naval defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the expansion of trade due to the global explorations of seafarers such as Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, the expansion of education, the writing of the first English novels, and of course the flourishing of theater with playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. Elizabeth chose to never marry, embracing the title of Virgin Queen, and thus died without an heir. As a result, she was succeeded by her closest relative, James VI of Scotland, who would then become one of England, uniting it with Wales and Scotland into one kingdom for the first time in history, another step towards British unity. Northern Ireland, along with other parts of the Emerald Isle, had been conquered earlier by Henry VIII, so that also became part of his realm. James faced a number of conflicts, not least one with Parliament, which he found too restrictive. The power struggle worsened during the reign of his successor Charles I and eventually degenerated into the Civil War of 1642-1649. The anti-royalist or parliamentarian forces were led by Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan who preached against the excesses of the monarchy and established a church. His army, known as the Roundheads, was pitched against the king's forces, the Cavaliers, in a conflict that tore England apart. It ended with victory for the Roundheads, with the king executed, England declared a republic, and Cromwell hailed as protector. Cromwell soon abused his powers, however, and installed a military dictatorship that outlived him when it passed to his son in 1658. Faced with what they saw as Republican tyranny, Parliament restored the monarchy in 1660 and crowned Charles II, although with diminished royal powers. The throne then passed on to James II, a Catholic who resurfaced some of the religious conflict and brought yet another war in 1688. This one, the Glorious Revolution, ended with his deposal after the invasion of William of Orange, who along with Mary II, James's daughter, ruled Britain after accepting Parliament supremacy, a key development in the democratization of the country. This was further cemented when in 1714, George I, a man from German royalty that spoke little English, became king, and thus was forced to rely on his cabinet and especially the prime minister to rule. The PM in question was Sir Robert Walpole, who from 1721 to 1742 fashioned the office into much of what it is today. There were 2 other crucial developments during this period that made the UK what it is now. The first was that Parliament passed the Acts of Union of 1707, which united England and Scotland into a single state, officially creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. This occurred to a large extent because Scotland had tried to establish a colony in the Darien Gap in Panama in 1698, but it failed catastrophically. Indeed, it was such a financial disaster that nearly a quarter of Scottish capital was lost, convincing them that an economic union with England would be beneficial. The second development was the Industrial Revolution, a series of technological advancements including machine tools, efficient use of water and steam power, and changes in iron-making that led to a dramatic increase in economic productivity. This, coupled with a dominant navy which grew in size and power as it continued to fight wars with the Netherlands, and especially France, and the expansion of colonies around the world, made the British a global one. Indeed, in 1870, when the empire reached its zenith, the UK controlled about a quarter of all world trade. By the 19th century, it governed 1/4 of the world's population, directly ruled almost 50 countries, and dominated many more with its commercial muscle. It also dramatically changed the physical space of the country. Some places became major suppliers of primary goods for the industrialization of the UK, like Northumberland and the Rhondda Valleys in Wales for coal. Cities also grew dramatically as people moved from rural areas to work in the mills and factories that developed, including women and children, earning the new urban landscape a description of Dickensian for the author of the era who best captured it in his writings, Charles Dickens. Meanwhile, conflict with European powers continued. In the 18th and 19th century was principally with France, occasionally allied with others. These led to some loss of territory like the American colonies in 1781, but usually it was the opposite, gaining Gibraltar in 1713, Canada in 1763, the Cape Colony, precursor to South Africa in 1795, Guyana in 1815, Singapore in 1824, and consolidating its position in India in 1748. But it also led to much loss of blood and treasure, especially during the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815, even as it was coupled with the heroism of people like Admiral Nelson and the Duke of Wellington, who were instrumental in defeating Napoleon. Still, the UK superpower status eventually resulted in a much calmer period, a peaceful time that came to be called Pax Britannica, and is most associated with Queen Victoria's reign. This relative peace would be shattered by two huge conflicts that would completely change the path of the country. The first was World War I, which, although first sparked by the seemingly distant assassination in 1914 of Franz Ferdinand, the heir of the Austro-Hungary throne, it brought about British involvement because of the perceived threat from Germany and a key alliance with the French. The British and their allies won, ending the war on favorable terms with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, but the victory came at a massive economic cost and the loss of nearly 900,000 lives in the empire. The cost of World War II would be even higher in some ways, but before that happened, the Irish, which had long resisted British control of their island, fought a guerrilla war for independence between 1919 and 1921. The British tried to maintain control by partitioning the island in 1920. But their authority collapsed in the south and east and were forced to recognize a free Irish state at the end of the war. The Parliament of Northern Ireland, dominated as it was by Protestants however, voted to remain a part of Britain. The problems at home were more economic in nature, especially with the mobilization of labor who demanded better conditions and pay with acts like the 1926 general strike. Things got even worse when the Great Depression hit in 1929, promptly causing 3.2 million people to be unemployed by the summer of 1932, reaching a staggering 70% rate in parts of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. An even bigger challenge came from Hitler in Germany, who began openly defying the Treaty of Versailles in 1936 and then annexed Austria in March 1938. Wary of starting another world war, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, along with France, tried to appease Hitler and even agreed to let him annex parts of Czechoslovakia in September of that year. The plan did not work. Less than a year later, Hitler invaded Poland, forcing Britain to finally declare war. World War II had begun. Unfortunately for the British, any advantage they might have had was wiped out when the Germans, in a surprise move, invaded the Benelux countries, defeated France, and nearly destroyed the bulk of the Allied forces as they attempted to evacuate the European mainland at Dunkirk in May 1940. Neville Chamberlain had resigned as Prime Minister a few weeks earlier, so the desperate situation fell on the shoulders of Winston Churchill. He was apt to the task. It took a little over 5 years. The suffering of bombardments, the largest seaborne invasion in history, the deaths of over 450,000 people in the empire, and some $120 billion in the UK alone. But in the end, the British were once again victorious over Germany and would play a role in the creation of the post-World War order. Still, the end of the war meant that the UK was forced to give up most of its colonies, starting with India in 1948, followed by most of Africa and Asia. By 1981, it had only a scattering of islands and outposts. Turned inwards, the country set to rebuild itself, creating the basis of the welfare state with the creation of the National Health Service in 1948 and allowing free movement from the Commonwealth, which brought a significant portion of immigrants from the former colonies to the UK. Then, in 1952, Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, starting a reign that would end up being the longest in British history. Since then, one could say that much of the country's history has been about managing decline, or perhaps trying to regain lost glory. One attempt was the joining of the European Union in 1973. Another was the election of Margaret Thatcher in May 1979. Still another was the election of Tony Blair in 1997. And yet another was the vote to leave the EU with Brexit in 2016. Some worked better than others, but the last one in particular, after having upended much of British politics for the better part of a decade, seems to be regretted by the majority of Brits. Today, the country faces an uncertain future with major challenges in housing, productivity, and an aging population. Whatever the future holds, if the past is any guide, the country will come out on the other side in better shape.